Today we're going to change an alternator on a 2012 Volkswagen Passat. The basic overview of this is the alternator is located there, and you will need to remove the air conditioning compressor and drop it out the bottom. The tools required for this exercise are a T25 Torx, a T45 Torx. You will need an M10 or 10mm 12-point Torx, a 15mm wrench, a 13mm wrench. A ratcheting wrench is handy if you have a 13mm one. You also need an 8mm wrench. Once again, a ratchet wrench is handy. You could also use an 8mm socket on a 1/4-inch drive ratchet. That'll be just fine. I have a 3/8 drive ratchet, an extension, which you may not actually need, and 13mm and 10mm sockets. I have both the shallow and deep sockets, respectively. You could probably just get away with using... No, I think you actually do need the deep socket for one. But these are all the tools required to accomplish this task. I totally lied. You need a 17mm wrench as well. I'll show you later. One of the very first things you should do is disconnect the battery. This is the positive terminal and this is the negative terminal. I recommend removing the negative terminal. So we just loosen that with our 10mm, and I use an extension for easier access. And then this wiggles right off. Bloop. And then what I do is I fold this back over and then rest the negative terminal on there so that won't go anywhere. First things first, you need to remove the belly pan. I'm not going to go over that, but it's basically 8 bolts down each side, or I'm sorry, 4 bolts down each side, which is 8 in total, and then there's 3 or 4 across the back. Those are the larger ones. The T25s are down the sides, the T45s are across the back. You drop the end towards the rear of the car and slide it out to get it out. And then after examining the belt routing, the first thing we're going to do is take apart the outer belt here so we can get the AC compressor off. So to loosen the belt and get this off, you take your 15mm wrench, you put it over the tensioner nut, and you turn it clockwise, so that's tighten basically, and the same goes for the upper tensioner. And so what I do is I take a wrench of a similar size, so this is a 16, and I'll actually hook it over the other wrench to give me a bigger lever, and then I can push on it like this, so I'm turning that clockwise, and then this will allow me to slide the belt off, and then you can release tension, pull your wrenches out, and you can get the belt out. And this belt only goes around the AC compressor, and the tensioner pushes on the back side of it up top, kind of where my finger is. Okay, this is the same ordeal. Let's see if I can do this with one hand. Oh yeah. There you go, just like that, with one hand. Get my wrench back. Now we can remove the AC compressor. To get the compressor out, move that belt out of the way. You can leave it hanging out in there. And then there's 3 bolts. They're 13mm. There's one here, there's one directly above it, and then there's one at the top and the back corner, which I cannot really show you. And the first thing you need to do after getting the belt loose is to get the electrical connector off. It is right here, and you're supposed to be able to squeeze the tab and just pull. Sometimes if they're dirty, you have to wiggle it. Now what I mean by squeeze the tab is you want to take the tab that's sticking up and push it towards the back of the connector, so towards the back of the compressor, and that lifts the tab inside off of the locking nub, and then you can pull that straight back and get the connector out. So now that our connector's loose and out of the way, the next thing we need to do is get the support bracket for the power steering hose. If you follow this line where my finger is up, you'll see a bolt head right there. There is a 10mm bolt, or nut, I'm sorry, on the end of that, and that's where this P-clip attaches to, which supports this power steering hose. So with your 10mm socket, undo that right there, and then pull the P-clip off, and then that'll give you access to this back bolt on the compressor, which will be a 13. And because there's a little stud sticking out of the head of the bolt, you'll want to use your deep socket on this one. Okay, I got that bolt out. Here's what it looks like. You can see here the head of the bolt has the stud sticking out of it. I just threaded the 10mm nut back onto the head of the bolt there so we don't lose it. But that should give you an idea of what it looks like. And here's the length of it. Now we're going to do these two front bolts to get our compressor down and out of the way. For this, I'm just going to keep the 13mm deep socket on here. You could probably use the shallow socket and an extension, but I just go in between these lines here. Okay, last bolt. Support the compressor with your free hand as you take the last bolt out. If you slightly push up on it and support it, it makes it easier to turn the bolt. As a matter of fact, you can get it to a point where you can finger it the rest of the way out. These bolts are the same length as that first bolt we took out. They just don't have the stud on the head. And now the compressor should just come out. Make sure you unplugged it. As long as you followed this, you should be okay on that end of things. And how this works is this will actually swing out of here. I can get it to cooperate. So this rotates. There it goes. This rotates around like this, so turn it towards the driver's side of the car and let the hoses unfurl, and then find something to support the compressor on. I actually used a box that's got another AC compressor in it. It's the right height since I'm on ramps to support the compressor. The name of the game is to not stress these hoses and connections out too bad. So just find something decent to rest it on, and that should give you access. And now, as you can see, we can easily see the bottom of our alternator. Next, we need to undo the wiring that's connected to the alternator. So you can see there's the battery cable that attaches to the alternator there. There will actually be a plastic cap on there, so you can just use a flathead screwdriver to pop that off. And then that is a 13mm nut if you have the factory alternator. If you have an aftermarket alternator, that will probably be 12mm. So just use your 13mm deep socket. You might be able to get a regular socket on there. And then you need to undo this connector up at the top of the alternator. It's the same thing where you got to find the locking tab, pull it towards the back of the connector, so like you squeeze and kind of pull towards the back of the connector at the same time, and then you can pull the connector off. If it's dirty, it might put up a little bit of a fight. I've discovered that it sometimes helps to push the connector like on further while you're squeezing and then pull off. Once again, just have a little bit of patience with it, and that should come off there for you. Okay, so with my alternator wiring all done, I was able to take it down, and I just tucked this behind the oil filter housing like that for now. That'll keep it out of the way. And the last thing we need to do before we're free and clear with the alternator is to remove this idler wheel. So this idler wheel is attached to this bracket with two bolts, one there and the outside one there. This is the 10mm 12-point Torx, so I'm going to use that with a wrench over it to loosen these bolts and take this down out of the way. Okay, here's our idler out. You can see where the two bolts are located and that they are in fact the 10mm 12-point Torx. So now with that out of the way, we have access to our alternator. So now we can start on the alternator bolts. There's two of them. You can see the back of the lower bolt there, and you can access the head of it from right here underneath the car. So this will be a 13mm. Yes, 13mm, and I'm going to use the shallow socket on this one. Okay, I got my 13mm on. And I got it loose enough now I can get it with my fingers. And you don't have to do anything special. It should pull all the way out. It's pretty long. Now we can do the top one. Okay, here's the top bolt. It's the same drill, except I used the deep socket on this one to allow me access. Break it loose. And eventually, you should be able to get it with your fingers once again. There it is. So now the alternator is free, but it's not going to quite come out so easily. There's one little trick that's going to help us a bunch here. So take that 17mm wrench that I mentioned in the beginning of the video, put it over your power steering pump high pressure line nut, and just break it loose. You don't have to take it all the way out, but we want to break it loose so the line can rotate. You can see down there that that line rotating is what's going to give us some room to work on getting the alternator out. As long as you break it loose like that and don't take it out, you will not lose any power steering fluid. So this next part, you can do it from underneath with a pry bar, but you want to be careful if you push the alternator up, because the plastic intake manifold is right on top of the alternator, and you don't want to push the alternator in and break the intake manifold. But there is a space right between the bracket and the alternator where you can slide this into and just gently pry. You don't want the alternator to fall completely out, because then it could fall into the fan. But just wiggle it and rock it enough to where you can get under the car to finish getting it out. All right, now comes the most fun part of this whole puzzle, and that is getting the actual alternator out. So I'm going to finish wiggling it to get it off the bracket. Actually, the pry bar will come in handy for this. Got to get it strung in here just right. Trying to make it so you can see what I'm doing at the same time. All right. So now the alternator is free. Now what you have to do is stand it up vertically, and then you can almost fit it between the fan, but it doesn't actually fit. You will hang up in any number of places. The best way I've found to get it out is to rotate the alternator around so the ears face the fan. And you want to be very mindful of the fan blades and not hurting them. Okay. Now the ears are facing the fan, and you're going to take one ear. So one ear should be pointing in front of the fan hub. This is how I have it facing to get it out. One ear is in front of the fan hub, right there. And you see the other ear is in the area between the fan blades. And so now what I'm going to do is, as I wiggle and pull this straight down, I'm going to rotate the fan at the same time to allow that ear to come down between the fan blades. You shouldn't have to force it. If you have to force it, you're not doing it right. And then you got to wiggle it between all the hoses and stuff. That's the easy part. And we're out. So, just like a manual would say, installation is reverse of removal. Right? Like it's always that easy. So now you're going to watch me insert this with the ears facing the same direction as before. Getting this around everything. I'm trying. There we go. Bloop. Okay. So now once again, I'll put an ear in the fan blade and an ear in the hub. I should have removed that nut. If it comes with a new 8mm nut, you might want to take it off there before you have to fight with it. Okay. So with one ear in the fan blade and one ear over the hub, you got to do the wiggle thing. There it is. And then you got to do the rotate thing. Just like that. And then set it in the bracket. And it's going to want to flop around because the nuts aren't compressed. So have your lower bolt ready and get it through that lower ear and into your lower hole. There we go. And just started a couple threads. The bolt's long enough, it's not like it's going to fall out. So, and what you want to do is get all the bolts in it before you tighten it. That's a general rule working on anything. If you have something that uses 2 bolts or 20 bolts, finger all the bolts in by hand before fully tightening or even starting to tighten any of them. It makes things a lot easier. So with both bolts in, now I'm going to tighten the top bolt first. And how this is going to work is you're going to get to a point where it goes from really easy to turn to slightly more difficult to turn, and you have to keep going because what you're doing at that point, if it's a new alternator, is you're sucking the nut up against the bracket. So the nut that holds this on actually kind of slides in the housing of the alternator, and when you turn it like this, it cinches up to the bracket to make everything nice and tight, so the alternator won't flap around in there. That's why we had to pry on it with a pry bar a little bit to get it out. That's why it takes a bit of wiggling to get it out. On most cars, you can actually smack the alternator casing usually towards the front, like you smack on the back of it towards the front, and that'll loosen those nuts up to the point where you can kind of wiggle the alternator out freely. But on this car, there isn't really enough space to do that. So now you can see it's not turning so easy, but it's not, incredibly difficult either. You're using the force of the threads to cinch that up. And then you'll feel the hard stop, at which point you want to do your final tightening. Okay, our new alternator is bolted in. If you look right here, you can see that there's the ear and the bracket, and then there's a gap between there where there's that silver sort of bushing, and that's the nut we were talking about. It pulls out of the body of the alternator and takes up that gap. So that's what I'm talking about when I mentioned that. So now that that's in, our very next step is to put the idler pulley and bracket back on, and then we're going to do the cables, not forgetting the 8mm nut that holds the P-clip for the cables in place. And if your new alternator comes with a 12mm nut, you will not be able to reuse the plastic cap. It is perfectly acceptable as long as that thread's on to use reuse the 13mm nut. So you might want to check that before you put the alternator up in there. If this thread's on freely and you don't have to force it or anything, I recommend just doing that, and then you can put the plastic cap back on. After you've got your idler pulley and bracket installed, your wiring connected back up, both P-clips for the wiring and the power steering pump line put back in place, don't forget to take your 17 and snug up your high pressure side power steering line. Since that's the only thing that uses the 17, I just leave the wrench right there to remind me to do that. And so now that that's done, we can go ahead and loop the belts back on. One neat noteworthy thing is, because the main drive belt is driven from the AC compressor instead of the crankshaft, because the crankshaft pulley drives the AC compressor directly, you can actually rotate all of the accessories to walk the belt back on when doing the tensioners. So that's what I just did there by rotating the power steering pump. Now I can release my wrenches and the belt is installed. And once again, as a reminder, it goes from the AC compressor around the outside of the idler with the bracket that we bolted on, straight up around the power steering pump, around the alternator using the back side of the belt, and then the front side of the belt goes around the water pump, and then around the tensioner on the back side, and then back down to the AC compressor. Okay, I went ahead and installed the lower drive belt back how it was. Be sure to give everything a good once over. Make sure you got all your tools out. Make sure all your clips, P-clips and everything are bolted back up correctly. Make sure your power steering line's tight. And now we're ready for a test. So the last thing to do is to come back over here to our battery and hook it back up. Just like that. Tighten this guy up. We'll be ready to go. This video is handmade, brought to you by no sponsors. If you found things useful in this video, please consider hitting the donation link in the description. If you don't have anything to donate, I completely understand. Just be sure and give me a thumbs up so that way this video can be recommended to others. If you enjoy cars, computers, and electronics, be sure to give me a subscribe. Till next time, have a good one.